The Farlands, home to the evil Farlands Man. How did this creature get here, and why is it so evil? Find out as we explore the story of the Farlands. Our story begins just after the end of the Great Illager War, just as peace had begun returning to the overworld. However, as peace was now settling in on the Minecraft world, all the Steve clones, who had originally been made to defend the villagers during this war, became obsolete. Now, although these clones had originally been made for this war, they had, over all these years, become an integral part of villager life. And as such, even after losing their primary function of defense, the villagers still decided to keep them, as after all they had built up quite a strong bond with most of these fierce warriors. And so, over the next few decades, life flourished for most of the villagers, as they farmed, traded, and slept, all while the Steve clones meticulously watched over them, keeping them safe. Well, all the Steve clones were like that, except one, as there was one Steve clone that wanted to do much more for the villagers than just protect them from the village, as he wanted to go out and find something that would progress their society in a massive way. And as such, as soon as this war was over, that Steve left the villagers and began on an exploration to find that something. And so, after he left all those decades ago, no one ever saw him again. But then, suddenly, out of nowhere, decades later, on one summer morning, he just appeared in a small, snowy village. Everyone was so curious to hear what he had found, and so very quickly, a crowd of villagers surrounded him, desperate to hear him. But the being that cared by far the most with what the Steve had to say was the Steve that was protecting this village. And so he pushed past all the other villagers just to talk to this missing Steve. But when he got to this Steve, he was dragged into a small hut, because this Steve wanted to talk in private. He had a secret he needed to share.
There is a wall at the end of this world, and anything that passes it will be granted with powers beyond our current capabilities. I saw it happen. But never tell anyone that
But before he could finish this message, he was flung into the air and exploded. The villagers all stood there for a moment, shocked and horrified at what they'd just seen happen to their beloved Steve. And then the realization of what had just happened sunk in, and they all began to run and scream. And so very quickly news spread across all of the villagers, and so other thieves from those other villages ran to this village and calmed these villagers down. And once they'd done that, they went to the only Steve that had a first-hand account to ask what had happened. However, he just said that that missing Steve floated into the air and exploded before he got the chance to say anything. He lied. But he lied because he didn't want any of the other clones to go out and test these wall powers, as he knew that there would probably be much suffering involved, and he didn't want any of his other friends to suffer. And so, not truly knowing what happened to the other Steve, the clones left that village and assumed it was just a malfunctioning discovery. And so, life moved on for everyone, as they went back to their normal day-to-day activities. But that Steve, he couldn't get the thoughts out of his head of that other Steve telling him about this wall and these powers. He had to do something. He had to go to that wall, so that he could gain those powers, and maybe he could help those villagers. And so, in the night, he woke up two of his closest villager friends, and told them everything. And together, they left the village, on a search for this wall of power. But as hours turned into days, and days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into years, they never found this strange wall that the Steve had told them about. But these brave adventurers continued onwards, as they climbed mountains, swam through oceans, and jumped over ravines. Even at night, when they faced the onslaught of evil monsters, did they ever stop, as they just continued to fight, or would flee. And they lived their lives like that for several decades, always on the search for this legendary wall. Well, that was until finally, this fierce group of three had found it, the world border, and it was just mesmerizing. And so Steve leapt off his horse and walked towards the border wall, and then he touched it, and then nothing happened. The other villagers stood behind him in anticipation, waiting to see these mythical powers they were told so much about. But again, nothing happened. Steve looked disappointed at this wall, It couldn't be that he travelled all this way and spent so much of his life doing this, all for nothing. And as such, he was getting quite angry. But to release this anger, he turned back to the border wall and punched again, this time with the full might of his powers. And this time, something happened. He went through the border, but instantly he started to take damage, and quickly he was dying. The other villagers ran to him to try and help, but it was no use. He was stuck on the other side. And just as this brave Steve, who had spent so much of his time trying to get here, was about to die, his life flashed before him. He opened his eyes, and he saw that he was somehow in the clouds, and that in front of him was a strange blue thing. He was confused at what he was seeing, and so he walked up to this blue thing. But as he does, it turns its head and starts levitating.
You, Steve Clone, have done something that no other being has ever been able to do. Not even that other clone could do this. But what you've done, no matter how impressive it may be, has gone against the great order of this world. And as such, I must curse you. Curse you with immortality.
That didn't sound too bad, thought the Steve, as he now had all the time in the world to help those villagers. But the spirit was not finished.
And I task you with protecting these borders with your life. And I demand you to not let any being escape here with their own still intact. Fail me and you shall be punished with eternal suffering.
The Steve was returned back to the border, his head facing the floor. The villagers ran up to him, asking him if it was okay. He knew what he had to do, but he really did not want to do it. But the Steve also did not want to suffer for all eternity, and so he lifted up his head and killed his two closest allies, as after all, they had reached the border. And as he killed his two closest friends, their souls were released and infused into him. Power came surging through him, but it all felt wrong. He shouldn't have done this, but it was too late. Their souls were now his, and he was now stuck being the defender of the border for all of eternity. And so now he just stands there, waiting for a new adventurer to appear. And every few decades, when a new adventurer does attempt to uncover the secrets of the border world, the Steve strikes and steals their soul. And again, he feels terrible about doing this, but he knew he had to do it, or else he would be incurring the wrath of the spirit, and he would suffer. However, because every single player that ever left to see this border never returned, legends spread about secret treasures that for some reason all the adventurers had found, and it was because of that they never wanted to return. And so because of these false legends, even more players started to turn up to the border and try and find that secret treasure. But every time they would just be met by the Steve, and they would have their soul stolen. Eventually, with all the soul power, the Steve had an idea where he could deter players from coming to this border, and thus he could save their lives. And that idea was to punch down into the ground, and using the powers of the souls, he would create mountain ranges, and these mountain ranges would have mazes, so that way any player that saw this terrifying sight would hopefully back away, and thus the Steve wouldn't have to kill another innocent traveller. But that plan was a complete failure, as any adventurer that had made their way millions of blocks to get here was more than willing to just scale a mountain in order to continue on their quest. And so once again, the Steve would be forced to attack and steal their souls. And this went on for centuries and centuries, with the Steve always hunting down every single adventurer that ever dared to enter his mountain and try to get to the world border. But while all of these adventurers were suffering immensely, so was the Steve, as over time the souls inside of him consumed his body and blinded him. However, when blinded, he could still sense every movement of the player, and so he would attack. But again, he didn't want this. He didn't want to hurt any other players, but he also knew his mission, and he did not want to suffer. But he did think of a way that he could stop all of this, and that was through using his soul powers again. And so this time he leapt into the air and crashed downwards, leaving behind a thick aura of lag by his Farland mountains. And so now, whenever an adventurer reaches the world border, they physically can't continue. The lag is too much. And so, without knowing it, their lives are saved, and they are forced to return home empty-handed. And so, over the next few decades, because of this excess lag, no more adventurers reach the Farland Mountains. And so, this finally puts a smile on the Steve's face, as he has now protected the border, and he doesn't have to hurt anyone. And so, he had become the Farlands Man. And so now he just stands there on the top of the Farland Mountains, looking over any adventurer that ever tries to reach him. But while he does that, those first adventurers that got here but fled because of the lag are now returning home, ready to share the story of the smiling man on the mountains and the strange Farlands. But as they return home, they return to a burning village. Thousands have been killed, and it's all because of that. To find out what that thing is and what happens next in this world, you'll need to watch this video.